He just wanted to get to the event, that's all. But on the way, a security guard started following him through the entire mall, step by step, stare after stare, as if he were a suspect. What no one imagined is that the man being followed was actually the main speaker of the night. And when he stepped onto that stage, everything changed. Humiliation turned into silence. Prejudice turned into a lesson. And the security guard's expression, "Oh, you need to see it." Now tell me, what would you do if someone followed you and then you had to teach a lesson to the very person who judged you? Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, comment where you're watching from, and turn on the notification bell because there are many more real stories coming your way.
Everything began on that ordinary Saturday afternoon, when the mall was crowded. Children running, families chatting, and store windows gleaming with promotions that caught the eye from afar. In the midst of that crowd, he walked calmly, carrying only a light backpack and an ID badge tucked in his pocket, the badge that would prove who he really was. But before he could take a deep breath and prepare for the event, he noticed a suspicious look from afar. It was the security guard, rigid, observant, following his every step as if he were watching a suspect. He had no idea that this simple walk to the auditorium would turn into one of the greatest lessons of the evening. And it was there, among colorful corridors and hurried people, that life began to write one of those stories no one ever forgets. As he moved forward, the weight of the guard's stare seemed to grow. With each storefront he passed, the feeling of being watched became more evident, as though any movement could become a reason for a public, embarrassing intervention. Still, he kept a steady pace. He knew he needed to reach the auditorium before the scheduled time. After all, soon he would be stepping onto the stage to talk precisely about rash judgment and invisible prejudice, ironies that fate often arranges with almost cruel precision. When he finally turned into the main corridor, close to the escalators that led to the upper floor, the guard picked up his pace. The approach was unmistakable, and the silence that followed seemed louder than all the mall's noise. He felt a quick chill down his spine, the kind that warns you things won't end simply. But instead of avoiding the confrontation, he stopped, turned around, and waited. The guard reached him with the rehearsed posture of someone who had lived that kind of situation dozens of times. He asked what was in the backpack, where he was going, why he was walking so quickly. There was no aggression in his voice, but there was suspicion, a suspicion that needed no words to explain itself. He took a deep breath, pulled the badge from his pocket, unhurriedly, showing the name, the title, the event. The guard frowned, surprised, and for a brief moment, the mall's noise seemed to fade, giving way to a strange, silent understanding. "Ah, you're the speaker?" the guard asked, in a tone that mixed apology with discomfort. "I am," he replied, still holding the badge. "And I think your question just became part of my presentation." The guard tried to explain himself, offered quick apologies, but he only smiled without irony. It wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about recognizing the impact of every gesture, every look, every silent judgment that shapes the daily lives of so many people. And when he finally entered the auditorium, minutes later, he noticed that something inside him had changed. Not anger, a new clarity, a certainty that sometimes the most powerful lessons don't happen on stage, but in the hallways, in unexpected encounters, in situations that force us to look at the world, and at ourselves, with more care. That night, even before the lecture began, the story was already written. A simple but profound story, one of those no one forgets because deep down, it speaks about all of us. The security guard approached slowly, but with a clear intention: to watch, inspect, judge. With each step, he seemed to reinforce the idea that the man didn't belong in that environment. Maybe it was the simple clothing, maybe the backpack, maybe the focused expression, or maybe it was plain prejudice. He felt the weight of that gaze, but kept his posture steady, his breathing controlled, like someone who had learned over a lifetime that being followed wasn't new, but still hurt. It hurt because he knew he was doing nothing wrong. It hurt because, in just a few minutes, he would be on stage speaking precisely about this: How people see you as less than you really are, until the truth appears with enough force to break judgments and open eyes. As the guard drew closer, the world around him seemed to slow down. The distant sound of children laughing, the automated announcements echoing, the rhythmic footsteps of people rushing by, all of it blended into an almost distant backdrop, as if the entire mall were holding its breath, waiting for the conclusion of that silent scene. He felt every muscle of his body alert, not out of fear, but out of an old, accumulated weariness that only those who have lived through such moments truly understand. When the guard finally stopped a few steps away from him, there was a heavy pause in the air, as if the atmosphere itself were waiting for the answer to an unasked question. The guard looked him over from head to toe, as if searching for something that could justify the approach. He found nothing, yet he still hesitated, as though suspicion alone were enough to turn him into a threat. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, though the tone made it clear that help was not what he was offering. It was surveillance. He took a deep breath. The kind of breath that restores, that organizes thoughts, that prevents an emotional outburst. He reached into his pocket and took out the badge, the small laminated rectangle that carried his name, his face, and the word "speaker" in bold. He didn't say anything at first. He simply raised the badge, letting the truth speak for itself. The guard blinked, thrown off balance. The rigid tone dissolved almost immediately. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I thought that—" "I know what you thought," he interrupted, calm but without softening the truth. "And that's exactly what I came here to talk about." The guard's eyes flickered in surprise. For a moment, he seemed to want to say something, to justify himself, to explain. But no explanation would be enough. No words could erase the weight of the look that preceded that approach. Even so, he didn't feel anger. He felt awareness, a sharp, necessary awareness. He placed the badge back into his pocket and, with a slight nod, continued on his way. Each step toward the auditorium carried a mix of strength and vulnerability. He knew that when he stepped onto the stage, he would speak with an authenticity that no study, no theory, and no rehearsed presentation could ever provide. Because the proof was right there, still fresh. Proof that judgments happen in seconds, but take years to undo. And as he walked, he realized that that silent pain, the one he knew so well, was not just a burden. It was also fuel to create change, to challenge narratives, to work toward a day when people like him could walk in peace without having to justify their existence at every corridor. That night, even before the first slide appeared on the screen, the most important lesson had already been given, and lived. As he walked toward the elevator that led to the auditorium floor, he heard the quick sound of the security guard's footsteps behind him. He could feel the distrust thickening in the air, like an invisible shadow. He took a deep breath and thought, "If I react, things get worse. If I run, I confirm what he thinks. If I stop, maybe he'll understand." It wasn't fair to have to think that way, but it was what life had taught him. The elevator opened, but before he could step inside, the guard placed an arm in front of him, blocking his passage, and began asking short, clipped questions, each one edged with hardness. What should have been just a walk to the stage was turning into an emotional barrier. A barrier built not by facts, but by prejudice. He felt the impact of that gesture like someone receiving an invisible shove. The hallway, until then just another space to pass through, became an uncomfortable stage where he was the defendant, without a formal accusation, without any reason, without a chance to defend himself. People around them slowed their pace, some pretending not to see, others casting curious glances, drawn to the tension in the air. That kind of scene always drew attention, and he knew exactly how the narrative would be interpreted by those watching from afar. The guard must have his reasons. "Where are you going?" the guard asked, his voice far too firm for such a simple question. He swallowed the answer he wanted to give and chose the one he needed to give. "Auditorium. I have an engagement there." The guard observed him with an uncomfortable intensity, narrowed eyes analyzing every detail, the light backpack, the simple clothing, the calm but weary expression. There was something in that gaze that said, without words, "I still don't believe you." "Do you have any ID?" came the next question, even shorter. He noticed a slight tremor in his own hands, not from fear, but from accumulated indignation. Still, he kept his composure. He unzipped the backpack with slow, controlled movements, almost choreographed so as not to trigger any silent alarm. He took out the badge folded inside a book and held it up. The guard's expression shifted, but not immediately. First came confusion, then surprise, and only then a hint of embarrassment trying to hide behind professionalism. "Oh, you're the speaker," he said in a quieter voice, as if the recognition somehow lightened the weight of the scene. He nodded without breaking eye contact. "I am, and ironically, I'm here to talk about situations just like this." The silence that followed was anything but comfortable. It was a thick silence, full of meaning, of unspoken words, of apologies that would fix nothing. The guard lowered his arm, allowing him to enter the elevator, but the gesture did not erase what had happened. He stepped into the elevator, pressed the button, and as the doors closed, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The encounter, though brief, had left marks. Proof that often the greatest barrier is not the closed doors, but the eyes that try to block your passage. And there, in that metal box carrying him to the stage, he decided that the episode wouldn't become just another bitter memory. It would become part of the message, part of the change. Because some prejudices are so silent and so automatic that they only reveal themselves when someone finally brings them to light. He responded calmly, even with indignation caught in his chest. He explained that he was headed to an event, that he was on time, that he needed to go up. But the security guard wanted more, wanted to search, to question, to confirm his own suspicion. That was when, for a moment, he felt that familiar sense of helplessness he had carried so many times throughout his life. The feeling of being treated as someone lesser, someone out of place, someone who doesn't belong where he is. But this time, something inside him reignited. He wasn't going there as a visitor, nor as a customer. He was going as an invited speaker, as a reference, as someone called to inspire hundreds of people. And that transformed the hurt into determination. Nothing, not judgment, not humiliation, would keep him from stepping onto that stage. With each question from the guard, with each suspicious look, he felt the old wound open a little more. But instead of bleeding, it lit up. It lit his mind with memories of all the times he had needed to prove his worth, justify his presence, reaffirm his identity in order to be taken seriously. He remembered school days when teachers mistook his intelligence for luck. He remembered his first job, where they watched him more than they taught him. He remembered the closed doors, the denied opportunities, the urge to give up, and how he always chose to keep going. "Are you sure you're authorized?" the guard insisted, as if the truth had to fit within his narrow view of the world. He took a deep breath. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture, didn't defend himself more than necessary. He simply took out his badge with the resolve of someone who, this time, wasn't there to ask for permission. He was there to assert who he was. The guard took the badge, read it slowly, ran his fingers over the plastic as if needing to confirm it was real. His expression changed, but not into an apology. It changed like someone who realizes his assumption has lost its strength. He returned the badge with a brief nod, almost a retreat. "You're clear to go," he muttered, but it was far too late to undo the damage. He placed the badge back in his pocket carefully, not out of delicacy, but out of symbolism. That small card was more than identification. It was a silent reminder of everything he had achieved, and also of everything that still needed to change in the world. As he began walking toward the elevator again, he felt his steps take on a different weight, a firm, conscious weight that came from someone who turns pain into purpose. It wasn't just about reaching the stage, it was about occupying the space with the full truth of who he was, even if some insisted on seeing only half. And as the elevator rose slowly, he realized that the humiliation from moments earlier was transforming into something greater, a new, sharpened strength, ready to become the words that would reach the people waiting for him upstairs. Because in the end, he knew. Stories like that were not meant only to wound, they were meant to awaken. With firmness, yet without losing his composure, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the rolled-up badge, slowly revealing the name, the photo, and the title. Keynote Speaker of the Event. The security guard's eyes widened, as if the world had spun faster for a second. The tension in the air shifted. His stern expression dissolved, replaced by a mix of surprise and discomfort. It was as though he had just realized he had pursued the wrong person, the person who, ironically, was about to speak about respect, resilience, and how to confront the silent prejudices that hurt more than most people imagine. And in that moment, he understood that life is wise. Sometimes, before stepping on stage, you have to face exactly what you're going to talk about. The security guard took a deep breath, as if trying to rearrange his own thoughts. The almost automatic professionalism that had guided him up to that point faltered, revealing a feeling he rarely let slip: shame. He stepped aside, giving space, allowing passage. But the gesture, though necessary, didn't erase the moment that had just happened. He, the speaker, kept his eyes steady. There was no arrogance, no desire for payback in his expression, only clarity. The clarity of someone who has learned to recognize prejudice, not in grand acts, but in small gestures, in quick suspicions, in silent barriers, in interruptions without cause, and above all in glances that say everything without uttering a single word. "Have a good event, sir," the guard said, his voice too soft for the rigid posture he tried to maintain. He simply nodded. It wasn't the time to deliver a speech there, in the hallway. There was an entire audience waiting for his words, but more importantly, there was something inside him that needed to be honored. The truth he had just lived moments before his presentation began. When he finally stepped into the elevator and the doors slid shut, he felt his heart beat in a deep, almost ritualistic rhythm. The episode might have seemed small, almost trivial to an outsider, but to him it was symbolic. A clear reminder that his struggles were not theory. They were practice. They were reality. They were the raw material of what he was about to share with the audience. And as the elevator ascended, he let out a brief smile, not of satisfaction, but of understanding. Because now he was certain. His lecture would not begin on the stage. It had already begun right there, in the hallway, in the silent confrontation between suspicion and truth, between judgment and identity, between pain and purpose. Life does not err in its script. Sometimes, it makes you live the lesson before allowing you to teach it. The elevator finally ascended, and as the doors closed, he felt his heart pounding, not from fear, but from the memory of every time he had lived through that same situation before. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him as a problem, as a risk, as someone out of place. But in that moment, he made a silent decision. None of it would stain his energy before the lecture. On the contrary, it would fuel it. Every injustice he had lived would become a spark of impact. Every piercing look, a note in his speech. Every doubt about who he was, another reason to prove that no one can dim the light of someone who knows their purpose. And right there in that elevator, he realized he was about to transform a fresh wound into a powerful message. The mirrored walls reflected not just his image, but the strength forming within him. A strength born not from anger, but from awareness. Awareness that this story, repeated so many times in so many places, was no longer a burden. It was a tool. It was living material, real and necessary, to reach the people waiting for him upstairs. He inhaled deeply, feeling the air fill his lungs with a new kind of clarity, as if each breath whispered, "You know who you are. Go on." As the elevator continued to rise, he mentally revisited the moments before the confrontation. The peaceful walk, the focus on the lecture, the sudden weight of a suspicious gaze. All of it now gained purpose. He no longer saw the experience simply as an obstacle, but as part of the narrative that made him authentic. It was that very experience, that still sensitive scar, that gave him authority to speak about prejudice, resilience, and dignity. When the elevator neared the auditorium floor, he felt his body relax. It was as if with each meter climbing upward, something within him rose as well. Pain became courage, humiliation became truth, discomfort became voice. The doors opened with a soft electronic chime, and he stepped out with steady strides. There, in that quieter, more elegant corridor, far from suspicious eyes, He reconnected with his mission. He knew that every word he would speak later carried not just theory, but lived experience. Not just speech, but evidence. Not just intention, but impact. And so, with a full chest and a sharpened mind, he walked toward the auditorium. Because that's what those who choose to turn pain into light do. They walk forward, even wounded, knowing their story might illuminate the path for many others. When he reached the event floor, he was greeted by a smiling, enthusiastic team who knew exactly who he was and had been waiting for him with admiration. The difference between their warm reception and the security guard's cold approach hit him hard. The contrast was so stark it felt like a shock, and he realized something profound. The right people recognize you by your purpose, the wrong ones by their prejudices. As he walked down the bright hallway, the organizers guided him with excitement, thanking him for being there and mentioning how eager the audience was to hear him. The corridor, decorated with banners, soft lights, and the distant buzz of the crowd, seemed almost symbolic, as if each step marked a transition between what he had just lived and what he was about to transform into a message. He smiled, not out of vanity, but because of the liberating feeling of finally being where he was meant to be. There, surrounded by people who recognized his journey, his talent, and his strength, he felt the indignation dissolve, making room for something greater: purpose. It was as if life itself were saying, with absolute clarity, "See, this is your place. Here, you don't need to prove anything." The organizers kept talking, excited. "The auditorium is packed. So many people came just to hear you. Your story inspires more than you think." Each comment warmed a part of his soul that had been marked by suspicion just minutes earlier. And paradoxically, it was precisely that suspicion that made everything now shine even brighter. Because he knew that this warm welcome wasn't just a courtesy, it was confirmation that, despite the obstacles, he had reached that place through merit, consistency, and truth. When he approached the side door to the stage, he could hear the murmuring of the audience. It was a lively, pulsing sound, full of expectation. A sound that reminded him that, on the other side of that curtain, there were people who didn't see him as a risk, a threat, or a suspect, but as a voice, a presence, a reference. He took a deep breath. He felt the weight of the mission, but also the lightness of being ready. The stage was waiting. The story, too. And in that moment, he knew he was about to turn a recent wound into a light capable of touching everyone who listened. Before stepping into the backstage area, he took a deep breath and observed the intense movement of the technicians adjusting lights, testing microphones, and organizing details. It was almost hypnotic. Everything seemed to conspire for that moment. Yet deep down, the image of the security guard trailing him, doubting him, seeing only the surface, still echoed. And that was when he realized the true power of his lecture that night. It wouldn't be just about overcoming challenges. It would be about seeing beyond appearances. And that gave even more strength to his words. The pain he felt in the mall corridor gained meaning. The discomfort became ammunition. The unease turned into clarity. It was as if life had handed him, just hours before his speech, a living, raw, real example of the very topic he carried in his heart. It wasn't theory. It was experience. It was truth knocking at the door, demanding to be shared. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and let the motivation transform into flame. He felt his body warm from within, as if every cell responded to the calling of his mission. His breathing steadied. His chest opened. His mind aligned. When his eyes opened again, there was a new firmness there, gentle but unshakable, from someone who understands that the message they carry is greater than any suspicious look. The technicians continued moving around him, but he was no longer just in that physical space. He was mentally on the stage, imagining each person in the audience, every expression, every heart open to receive what he had to say. And at the same time, he thought of the security guard, not with resentment, but with purpose. Because in a way, the lecture existed for people like him. For those who judge too quickly, for those who see too little, for those who believe appearance defines character. He took another deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the privilege of being able to transform lives with words. In that moment, he was no longer just a speaker. He was a mirror that would reflect not only his own strength, but also the hidden prejudices many insist on ignoring. And then, aligned with his mission, he crossed the backstage curtain, ready, steady, lit from within, prepared to shift the perspective of everyone willing to listen. The production team informed him that only a few minutes remained before the start, and he walked over to the large mirror in the improvised dressing room. He looked at himself and saw something beyond the reflection. He saw his entire journey reflected there. The difficult days, the silent battles, the no's that nearly knocked him down, the closed doors, the looks, like the security guards, that tried to tell him he didn't belong in certain places. But he also saw his strength, his resilience, his ability to turn pain into purpose. The image in the mirror seemed to speak to him, not with words, but with memory. Every scar, every mark of resistance, every hard-earned achievement was there, stitched into his posture, his expression, the deep breath he drew before facing the world. He remembered every time he had thought of giving up, every moment he questioned whether he would actually get anywhere, every time he believed, if only for a moment, that maybe the outside voices knew more than his own. And yet, he was there, standing, ready. "You made it this far because you didn't give up, even when they tried to discourage you," he told himself, almost like a mantra, letting the phrase vibrate inside his chest. Those words weren't just motivation, they were acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of the courage to keep going when no one applauded, of the beautiful stubbornness of someone who insists on believing in their own path, even when the world tries to push them out of it. With that thought pulsing strongly, he straightened his shoulders, felt his spine align as if his own story were holding him up, adjusted the microphone clipped to his clothes, and took another deep breath. The tension in his muscles transformed into presence. Insecurity turned into clarity. Pain into truth. Outside, the audience waited. The team gestured with gentle urgency, signaling that it was time. And he knew. He wouldn't step onto that stage carrying only content. He would bring soul, lived experience, the full truth of someone who had to overcome many versions of "you can't" to reach the "this is where you're meant to be." And then, with a steady heart and an awakened mind, he took the first step toward the light. When his name was announced over the sound system, the noise of the audience erupting filled the space like a powerful wave. He felt the energy of hundreds of people waiting for him, believing in him, trusting the message he would bring. It was as if every applause said, "We're with you." That collective force washed through him completely, warming what was still cold inside, dissolving any trace of the discomfort he had carried up to that moment. But before crossing the black curtain, he remembered something essential. Nothing, absolutely nothing, happens by chance. Perhaps the episode with the security guard had happened precisely to reinforce the essence of his speech. Perhaps life had placed that obstacle in his path as a clear, steady reminder that the struggle still exists, and that the world needs to hear about it. It was as if reality itself had rehearsed with him, just minutes earlier, the very message he was about to deliver to the audience. He closed his eyes for a second, just one. Enough to silently give thanks for the journey, for the strength, for the opportunity, and even for the pain, because it had shaped him. He felt his heart beat at the right cadence, no longer accelerated by indignation, but by responsibility. With one last deep breath, he straightened his posture, adjusted his expression, and allowed courage to take the place of any lingering doubt. Then he took the first step and crossed the curtain, stepping onto the stage with firmness, presence, and truth. The light found him. The audience roared. And in that moment, he was not just a speaker. He was living proof that no persecution, no judgment, and no doubt can stop someone who was born to inspire, and who had finally found his place shining before the world. The moment his feet touched the stage, the light fell upon him as if the universe had aligned everything for that instant. The audience greeted him with applause so intense it made his chest resonate, a wave of energy coursing through every fiber of his body, reminding him of the reason behind every battle, every obstacle he had faced. Yet, even in the presence of that immense force from the crowd, he could see, at the back of the hall, the security guard standing there, watching everything with a confused, almost regretful expression. It was like witnessing two worlds collide, the world of those who judge by appearance and the world of those who are judged but triumph nonetheless. He realized that the tension was not a burden, but an opportunity, a reminder that his message was not limited to inspiring those who already believed. His mission was also to reach those who still see through prejudice, superficial judgment, and fear of the different. And in that contrast, he found conviction. Every doubtful or surprised glance became fuel for his words. He knew that the story of that night needed to reach exactly the people like that security guard, so they could understand that no one should be limited by assumptions. He was not there merely to move people emotionally. He was there to transform perceptions, plant seeds of reflection, to open doors that many had never even imagined existed. The stage, the light, the audience, everything conspired to make his message resonate with full force. He took a deep breath, feeling the certainty of someone who knows that true inspiration is born not only from applause, but from the quiet change that begins to happen in the eyes of those who once judged without seeing. In that moment, he became not just a speaker, but an agent of transformation. With the microphone in hand, he began speaking about difficult journeys, winding paths, and how, so often, we are forced to prove our worth over and over just to be seen as equals. Every word came with the precision of someone who knows pain up close, and the audience fell into absolute silence, absorbing each sentence as if they were arrows of truth piercing the heart of reality. It was an intense, visceral connection, built on empathy and recognition. Then he paused. He looked around, feeling every attentive gaze, every held breath, every suspended expectation. And he said, "Today, before arriving here, someone doubted me because of how I was dressed, not because of who I am." The audience reacted immediately. Expressions of indignation, surprise, and a silence heavy with understanding filled the air. But what made that night remarkable was not just the exposure of injustice. It was the way he transformed it into a lesson in greatness. It wasn't a speech of anger. It was a demonstration of inner power. Every word carried authenticity. Every sentence was grounded in real experience, and every glance toward the audience conveyed confidence and clarity. He continued with firmness but without resentment. Growth does not come from anger. It comes from clarity. And as he spoke, the energy in the auditorium shifted. Indignation blended with inspiration. Surprise turned into reflection. He showed that facing prejudice and obstacles doesn't have to breed bitterness. It can create wisdom, strength, and purpose. In that moment, every person in the audience understood that greatness is not measured by what others see, but by the ability to turn pain into light, judgment into learning, and obstacles into opportunity. He spoke not merely to be heard, but to be felt. And with each sentence, the message spread. No one who knows their own worth can be defined by superficial glances or hasty judgments. As he recounted the details of the episode at the mall, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, charged with emotion. It was as if each person there were silently reliving a similar situation, a moment when they had been judged without reason, diminished by appearances or prejudiced glances. And that identification was powerful, almost tangible in the air. He could feel it, and he knew that the wound he had just endured was not his alone. It belonged to many, scattered across the stories the audience carried within them. But the brilliance of the speech did not lie in the pain, it lay in the turnaround. He calmly, firmly explained that he would not let prejudice define his mood, his purpose, or his dedication. That injustice might try to shake him, but it could never erase his essence or prevent him from moving forward. And then, in a moment that struck the auditorium like a lightning bolt of awareness, he said, "People can try to stop you, but they cannot interrupt who you choose to become." The silence that followed was broken by sighs, fixed gazes, and deep breaths. That sentence touched every heart present, as if it were a mirror reflecting personal experiences, hidden struggles, and quiet strengths. In that moment, he was no longer just a speaker in front of an audience. He was a reflection of all who had been wronged, living proof that pain transformed into purpose generates impact. And as he continued to speak, the energy in the auditorium shifted. It was no longer just attention. It was recognition. Not just empathy, it was inspiration. Every word he spoke became a bridge, connecting individual stories into a collective feeling that no one needs to bow to expectations or the judgments of others, and that true strength arises from within, from clarity about who you truly want to be. With each passing minute, the atmosphere shifted. The audience, once merely curious, was now fully immersed in the narrative. People nodded in agreement. Others discreetly wiped away tears, and some breathed deeply, as if absorbing each word with the intensity of someone recognizing their own story reflected back. The silence was dense, filled with attention and empathy, as if time itself had slowed to allow every sentence to land with weight and clarity. And in the background, the security guard remained standing, listening to everything. Motionless, almost rigid, he looked like someone being confronted not by another person, but by his own reflection. From his expression, one could see the beginnings of understanding, a late but real realization of the gravity of what he had done minutes before, the quick judgment, the unfounded suspicion, the glance that tried to diminish someone who did not deserve to be diminished. But the speaker was not there to expose, humiliate, or blame. His purpose was something else: to transform, to turn pain into a lesson, judgment into reflection, prejudice into awareness. He demonstrated, without pointing fingers or accusing, that it is possible to respond to injustice with greatness, clarity, and presence. That it is possible to turn the page without hatred and still make a difference in the world of those watching. And that was precisely what made the moment so powerful. Each sentence was a reminder that true change does not rely on aggressive confrontation, but on the steadfastness with which you remain true to yourself. He showed that when you transform pain into purpose, you change not only those who see you, but also those who judged you, opening doors to awareness, respect, and new perspectives. On the stage, under the bright light, he became a living example of a simple yet rare lesson. Greatness is not just about achieving. It is about elevating, teaching, and transforming, even in the face of those who insist on doubting you. Reaching the most emotional point of the lecture, he began to speak about purpose. With a firm voice, yet full of empathy, he explained that his mission was not to step onto the stage to be admired, but to remind every person there that they have value, even when the world insists on saying otherwise. He spoke about the times when everyone, at some point in life, has been underestimated, ignored, or misunderstood. That everyone has felt the weight of judgment, the chill of exclusion, the silence of those who should have offered support. True triumph happens when you choose to keep going, despite all of this, he said, looking directly at the audience, letting each word resonate, full of truth. And slowly, the reaction began. The audience started applauding even before he had finished that part. It was not just politeness or formality. It was spontaneous, genuine, cathartic. Each clap seemed to release something long held back, a contained emotion, a silent recognition of the personal struggles each person there had faced. And in that moment, he noticed the security guard. The man who, minutes before, had followed him with suspicion, now lowered his head. It was not just shame. It was understanding. It was the realization that the person he had judged so quickly was not a suspect, nor someone out of place. He was someone who had won battles the guard could not even imagine, someone who carried a light capable of transforming not only that audience, but also anyone who, for a moment, had doubted his worth. The silent awareness of the security guard, the delayed recognition, made that moment even more powerful. Because the true victory of the lecture was not only in the words or the applause, but in the change happening right before him, in the understanding that greatness is not measured by appearance but by the impact you create, the purpose you carry, and the courage to keep going even when the world doubts you. And there on that stage, under the lights and the attentive gaze of hundreds of people, he was no longer just a speaker. He was living proof that it is possible to overcome, transform, and inspire, even in the face of prejudice and suspicion. As he stepped toward the center of the stage, he felt something he had never felt before. It was not just anxiety, nor merely responsibility. It was the clear, visceral sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Every step seemed to fall into the rhythm of his own life, as if the floor beneath his feet recognized the place he had earned through effort, persistence, and courage. The audience shone under the lights, a sea of attentive faces full of expectation, respect, and admiration. Each gaze was a silent confirmation that his story had reached the right ears, that every word would carry the weight and strength of lived experience. Yet, in the corner of his peripheral vision, there was the security guard, standing with crossed arms, motionless, trying to comprehend how this simple man, the one he had just frisked and pursued, had now become the protagonist of the evening, the center of attention, someone capable of touching so many lives with his words. For the speaker, this was not a reason for arrogant pride, but for deep reflection. He knew that life often places shadows in the path precisely so that, when you step onto the stage, the light carries even more purpose. Every obstacle, every doubtful look, every premature judgment, all of it gained meaning in that moment. He felt the weight of the mission in every fiber of his body, in the shoulders bearing responsibility, in the chest beating firmly, in the hands gripping the microphone with determination. And at that moment, he decided he would deliver not just a lecture, but the most powerful truth he carried: that adversity, prejudice, and distrust do not define who you are, but can strengthen the light you hold and the force you share. The silence in the auditorium transformed into vibrant expectation. He took a deep breath, aligned his posture and heart, and prepared to turn every word into impact, every story into inspiration. Because there, at the center of the stage, it was not just a presentation, it was a mission, a full-hearted delivery, a testimony that true greatness is born from the courage to remain true to oneself, even in the face of shadows. The host finished speaking, and the audience erupted into applause so intense that the floor seemed to vibrate, each clap resonating like a confirmation of the unique moment unfolding. He walked to the microphone with steady steps, yet his heart overflowed with emotion. There was no more insecurity, no more resentment. There was only conviction, a quiet certainty that every obstacle he had faced up to that point had prepared the ground for this very moment. He cast a quick glance at the security guard, not in challenge nor in bitterness, but in compassion. It was a look that silently said, "I know you didn't know who I was, but now you will understand who we can be." A look filled with empathy, the strength of someone who transforms judgment into learning and pain into purpose. Then, with a deep, meaningful voice, he began the lecture with a phrase that echoed through the auditorium like thunder. "Never underestimate someone by what you see, because what you don't see is far greater." The effect was immediate. A reverent silence settled over the room. Every person in the audience held their breath, feeling the weight of truth in those words. It was impossible to look away, impossible to ignore. In that moment, he was not speaking merely to be heard. He was speaking to be felt, to awaken awareness, to transform perceptions. The security guard, still standing in the back, seemed small in the face of the magnitude of the message unfolding, and as the entire auditorium absorbed every syllable, the speaker knew. This moment was not only about inspiring others, but about proving to himself and to everyone around that light and purpose can overcome any judgment, any shadow, and any doubt. He then began recounting the experience he had just lived, without dramatizing, yet without softening it. He spoke clearly about every detail, how it felt to be followed, the sharp awareness that he had been judged solely by his appearance, and how that situation could have ruined his night if he had allowed it. Each sentence was measured, filled with sincerity, and seemed to open small wounds in the listeners because, in some way, everyone there had faced moments of injustice, misjudged glances, and premature judgments. But he was not seeking victimhood, quite the opposite. He turned the episode into a bridge, a lesson, an example of what it means to maintain one's integrity in the face of adversity. With firmness and without resentment, he said, "People try to define your worth by looking only at your exterior, but your real worth is in what you build when no one believes in you." The audience remained silent for a moment, absorbing every word. Then many began to be moved, subtly at first, then more visibly. Some wiped away tears, others drew deep breaths, as if the story had touched something deeply buried. Because truth has that power. It does not hurt, it does not destroy, it illuminates. It shows what is essential, reveals hidden strength, ignites courage, and offers clarity. In that moment, he was not merely sharing an experience, he was offering light, a mirror, and a path. And the entire audience felt called to see beyond appearances and to recognize the value they carry within themselves. As he progressed in his speech, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The silence was not merely attention, it was absorption, almost reverence. He explained that the world constantly creates labels, and that if you are not strong, you end up believing them, allowing other people's definitions to limit your own vision of yourself. He said that the worst prison is not external judgment, but the doubts you internalize, those that quietly settle in, eroding confidence and courage. Then, in a moment charged with intensity, he delivered the line that even made the security guard lift his head, as if struck by a jolt of reality. Don't let the way you are treated determine the way you grow. The entire auditorium exhaled a collective breath. It was not applause. It was not noise. It was recognition, absorption, the weight of something that touched deeply. It was the kind of moment that doesn't need applause to be significant. It is significant on its own. The energy of the room shifted in a nearly tangible way. In the eyes of the people, the transformation was visible. A new understanding, a freedom being awakened, a quiet courage emerging. He was not merely giving a lecture. He was freeing people, showing that it is possible to break invisible chains, rewrite internal stories, and move toward a growth that no one else can prevent. And as he spoke, each word seemed to travel through time and space, touching not only the present but the echoes of every past experience in the audience. In that moment, he was more than a speaker. He was a catalyst for change, a beacon for those willing to see beyond judgment. As he concluded, the audience rose in one of the loudest ovations of the night. It was not just admiration, it was gratitude. Every clap, every cheer, every gesture conveyed deep recognition, as if the energy of that moment were being shared from heart to heart. He felt that vibration run through his entire body, a silent confirmation that every word, every story, every emotion shared had reached exactly where it needed to. As he left the stage, still feeling the echo of that energy in his chest, he was surprised by the security guard. The man approached hesitantly, eyes misty and voice nearly failing. I was wrong about you. I'm sorry. The speaker smiled with serenity. Not the smile of someone who wins a dispute, but the smile of someone who understands deeply. And he replied, "No need to apologize. What matters is what you learned today." The security guard was left speechless, because there in front of him was a man who carried no resentment, only light. Light enough to transform judgment into learning, distrust into reflection, and prejudice into awareness. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone present that true victory is not about proving those who judged you wrong. True victory is greater. It is inspiring those who judged you to become better. It is transforming pain into purpose, distrust into empathy, and resistance into an opportunity for change. The silence that followed, heavy with emotion, said it all. This was not just a lecture ending, but a story of transformation spreading, touching hearts and redefining perceptions. There, light prevailed, and everyone in that auditorium felt it deeply.